It was a storm-lashed night off the coast of Savannah, where the Atlantic roared like a wounded beast, and the rain sliced sideways across the deck of a Coast Guard cutter. Picture yourself gripping the cold steel railing, uniform drenched, salt spray biting your face, when through the chaos you glimpse it. A battered wooden crate, half submerged, rocking violently in the foam. Would you call it in, stick to protocol, tell yourself it's just debris? Or would you let your heart override your orders, dive headfirst into the churning black, and pull it to safety? For Frank Bishop, a man weathered by decades at sea, the choice should have been easy, until he heard it. The faintest whimper, barely audible over the shrieking wind, the sound of 4 fragile lives trapped inside. But what if this rescue was about to drag him into a storm far more treacherous than the one beneath his feet? Would you still dare to jump? Before I take you deeper into Frank's story, let me ask, do you know a seaside city somewhere on the map? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Tell me the name of that place, because somewhere out there, in a city you know, a new story of courage may already be taking shape. And now, let me tell you this one. The Atlantic was a monster that night. Black, roaring, restless. The September storm had swept in hard and fast off the coast of Savannah, Georgia, hammering the steel hull of the U.S. Coast Guard patrol ship with sheets of rain so fierce they struck like thrown gravel. Wind howled through the rigging, salt spray lashing every exposed inch of the deck. The night sky was a chaotic smear of thunderclouds and jagged lightning, splitting the heavens like the cracked glass of a shattered window. Sergeant Franklin Frank Bishop stood on deck, fingers clenched white around the cold steel railing. At 52, Frank was a tall, broad-shouldered man whose strength had weathered time, though not without a cost. His hair was a thick salt and pepper mop cropped short beneath his storm-soaked cap, his square jaw lined with deep creases, a testament to years spent fighting wind, sea, and the harder storms inside himself. There was a scar, faint but unmistakable, slashing across his right eyebrow, a relic from a long-ago maritime accident that had claimed 2 crewmates and left Frank with a survivor's guilt he never entirely shook. He was respected by his team not just for his authority, but for his grounded, unshakable calm, the kind of man who never barked orders, but whose low, steady voice made men move. "Sergeant, we should pull back!" shouted Ensign Kyle Reyes, barely heard over the shriek of the wind. Kyle was in his late 20s, slim and wiry, his dark hair plastered to his forehead under his hood, eyes wide with anxious energy. The youngest on the crew, Kyle always carried a slight edge of nerves when the weather turned bad. Not cowardice, but the sharpness of a man who hadn't yet learned how to carry danger like an old coat. "We've got waves hitting 30 feet. Frank didn't answer. His eyes were fixed out over the railing, narrowing against the rain as another flash of lightning lit up the boiling sea, and there, rocking violently between the crests, was something unnatural. Not a barrel, not driftwood. A wooden crate, large, half-submerged, its battered frame splintered but somehow still holding together. "Captain!" Kyle yelled toward the bridge, but Frank lifted a hand. "Hold!" His voice cut across the chaos, low but firm. He turned to Kyle, rain dripping from the hard lines of his face. "Get me a rope." Kyle hesitated. "Sergeant, regulations say..." "Now, Kyle." Kyle ran. Frank shrugged off his soaked jacket, revealing a broad chest under a dark thermal undershirt clinging wetly to his skin. His arms were roped with muscle hardened by decades of sea labor. His hands, rough and scarred, moved with practiced efficiency as he secured the lifeline around his waist, knotting it tight. "Frank, you sure about this?" called Chief Petty Officer Sarah Lively, stepping up beside him. Sarah was a woman in her early 40s, tall, with wiry strength and sun-creased skin, her copper-colored hair tied back in a no-nonsense braid. She had the steady, no-frills demeanor of someone who'd worked her way up through the ranks, respected for her sharp eyes and even sharper tongue. She had known Frank for years and had learned to read the subtle shifts in his face. Tonight, she saw the set jaw and the flicker of something harder in his eyes, something stubborn. "There's something in that crate, Sarah." "There's something under it, too," she shot back, nodding grimly toward the water. Sure enough, as another wave lifted the crate, a dark shape flickered below, sleek, cutting, unmistakable. A dorsal fin. Frank exhaled slowly. "I know." Without waiting for another word, he vaulted the railing. The sea hit him like a hammer, cold, crushing, swallowing him whole. For a heartbeat, the world vanished in a blur of salt and black, the rope tugging at his waist as the waves tossed him like a rag doll. Frank kicked hard, boots straining, muscles screaming, fighting his way toward the bobbing crate as the current threatened to pull him under. He reached it, hands slamming against wet wood. His fingers scrambled for purchase as the crate lurched dangerously, almost slipping from his grasp. The water surged, dragging at his legs, and that's when he saw the shadow. The shark swept past, silent and massive, its dorsal fins slicing the water no more than 6 feet from his boots. Frank clenched his jaw, heart thundering. One wrong move, one bad wave. But the sound that came then cut through his panic like a knife. A faint, desperate whimper. Frank surged up, pulling his body halfway onto the crate, ignoring the splinters that bit into his arms. His hands fumbled at the lashed ropes crisscrossing the crate's top, cutting them free with a shaking pocket knife. The lid came loose, and with a groan of wood and a gasp of breath, Frank pulled it open. Inside were 4 golden retriever puppies, perhaps 6 or 7 months old, crammed together in a sodden heap. They were heartbreakingly thin, their ribs sharp against matted golden fur. One lifted its head weakly, large brown eyes dulled with exhaustion, a faint whimper breaking from its throat before it slumped against the others. Frank's throat tightened. He yanked the crate toward him, kicking hard against the pull of the current, waving his free arm toward the ship. "Pull us in!" he bellowed, his voice raw against the storm. Back on deck, Kyle and Sarah scrambled to haul on the rope, muscles straining as the waves fought to keep Frank and the crate in their jaws. For a moment, it seemed like the ocean would win. But Frank was a man who didn't let go, not when it counted. His boots scraped steel as they hauled him over the railing, salt water pouring from his clothes, his arms locked tight around the crate. As the last of the storm's fury battered the deck, Frank collapsed onto the planks, chest heaving, the crate cradled against his chest. Sarah crouched beside him, pushing wet hair from her face, her sharp blue eyes wide. "Jesus, Frank, you're bleeding!" She gestured to a long gash across his forearm, likely from the crate, or perhaps the shark's fin slicing past. Frank only shook his head. His breath came in shallow gasps as he pried the crate open wider. The 4 puppies lay huddled, their fur clumped with seawater, their bodies trembling with cold, but they were alive. He reached in with shaking hands, lifting one gently, a little male, his golden coat dulled and heavy, his breath fluttering like a candle in the wind. Frank pressed the pup to his chest, feeling its faint heartbeat against his own. "We got you," Frank murmured, voice raw. "You're safe now." And above them, the storm raged on, indifferent. The storm had passed by the time the Coast Guard cutter docked at Savannah's pier, but the air was still heavy, soaked in the smell of wet salt and churned-up seaweed. The early morning sun fought its way through tattered clouds, casting a pale, bruised light over the water. Frank Bishop climbed stiffly down the gangplank, his soaked uniform clinging to him, cradling the wooden crate wrapped in blankets. Inside, 4 pairs of tired, frightened eyes watched the world with the hollow gaze of creatures who had been too close to the end. Frank's house sat at the edge of the river, a humble, weathered place, single-story, with white-painted wooden siding that had long since peeled, and a sagging front porch where a rocking chair creaked gently in the breeze. The house had been his refuge for nearly 2 decades, ever since his wife's passing. That loss had turned Frank inward, transforming a once boisterous, sharp-tongued sailor into a man of quiet routines, long silences, and a deep, unspoken grief that clung to the corners of every room. Waiting at the door was Daisy Monroe, a woman of 34, her lean frame wrapped in a practical denim jacket over navy blue scrubs, her copper-red hair tied back in a no-nonsense ponytail. Daisy had freckled skin, green eyes sharp with intelligence, and a ready half-smile that could disarm most tension. She had been Frank's neighbor for years, running a small veterinary clinic out of town, and though their friendship was never loud, it was steady. Daisy had always admired Frank's quiet steadiness, while Frank respected Daisy's relentless drive to help every broken creature that crossed her path. Daisy stepped forward, eyes narrowing as she caught sight of the crate. "Frank, what in the world?" "They were adrift out there," Frank rasped, voice rough from the cold, holding the bundle out to her. 4 of them. Daisy didn't ask more. She reached out instinctively, her arms practiced and sure, pulling aside the blankets to inspect the pups. "Oh, you poor things," she murmured softly. The puppies were in miserable shape, tangled golden fur caked with salt, ribs too sharp, paws trembling from exhaustion. Frank crouched beside her as she worked, his own movements slowed by the ache of a night spent battling the sea. "They've been through hell, Daisy." Behind them, the front door creaked open. Eli Bishop, 17, lanky with an awkwardness that clung to his every move, peered out. Eli had sandy blonde hair that fell a bit too long over his pale forehead, a scattering of freckles, and wide, cautious gray eyes that rarely met a stranger's gaze. Eli had been living with Frank for the past year, having moved in after his parents' bitter divorce. The boy struggled with crippling social anxiety, rarely speaking more than a sentence at a time, but he and Frank shared an unspoken bond, a mutual understanding of what it meant to feel like the world had passed you by. Eli's eyes lit up as he saw the puppies. Without thinking, he stepped outside, bare feet on the cold porch. His hands hovered in the air, hesitant, unsure if he was allowed to touch. Daisy gave him a soft nod. "Come on, Eli, let's get them inside." Inside the house, Daisy set up a makeshift triage station on the living room floor, laying out towels, bandages, and antiseptics from her ever-ready vet's bag. She worked quickly, her hands sure, murmuring soft reassurances as she cleaned salt and grime from the puppy's fur. Frank watched silently from a battered armchair, arms crossed over his broad chest, the deep creases at the corners of his eyes sharpening. He had always admired Daisy's capacity to give her whole heart to the smallest lives. One by one, the puppies received names, courtesy of Eli, who knelt nearby, gently stroking each trembling head. The largest pup, who had been the first to lift his head on the ship, was Buddy, a classic golden, broad-chested even at his young age, with a steady gaze that marked him as the group's leader. Beside him curled Bella, the only female, smaller and slighter, her delicate features marred by faint scars beneath her golden coat. Max, the liveliest despite exhaustion, was thin and wiry, with a narrow face and sharp, curious eyes. And last was Charlie, the quietest of the group, a slightly darker shade of gold, who flinched at every sudden movement, eyes wide and haunted. As Daisy worked, her fingers brushing gently across Bella's side, she froze. "Frank," she said carefully, her voice low, "look at this." Frank came to kneel beside her, frowning as Daisy parted the matted fur. Beneath Bella's golden coat, faint scars crisscrossed her skin. Not random scratches, but a clear, deliberate pattern, thin lines etched like a grid. "These aren't normal," Daisy murmured. "Frank, they're symmetrical." She checked Buddy next. The same. Max, too. Charlie. All four carried identical marks, like some cruel blueprint had been pressed into their skin. Frank's mouth hardened. "What does that mean?" Daisy shook her head. "I don't know, but someone did this on purpose." Eli sat nearby, his pale fingers tangled in Max's damp fur. The puppy gave a soft, grateful lick, and for the first time in days, Eli gave a tiny, tentative smile. Frank saw it, the way the boy's shoulders relaxed just slightly, and felt a faint warmth stir in his chest. Max wagged his thin tail, pressing himself closer, as if recognizing a kindred spirit. As the afternoon stretched on, Frank busied himself repairing the old heater, his hands working mechanically, mind restless. Daisy prepared warmed food for the pups, coaxing them to eat small bites, keeping her voice low and calming. Outside, the storm clouds had broken, but the wind still rattled the windows, and Frank found himself staring out at the gray sky, a knot tightening in his gut. Something was wrong. 4 puppies abandoned at sea, branded with scars no animal should carry. That night, after Daisy left, Frank sat by the fire, the 4 pups curled in blankets near his feet, Eli on the couch, absently running his fingers over Max's soft ears. Frank's gaze drifted to the fireplace mantel where an old photo sat. A black and white shot of his younger self with his wife, her eyes laughing, her hand tight in his. He let out a long, slow breath. They had all been through hell, each in their own way. But maybe, just maybe, there was still a way forward. Night had fallen hard over the Savannah riverside, wrapping Frank Bishop's little home in a blanket of uneasy quiet. The storm had left behind puddles that reflected the silver glow of the moon, and the old wooden dock creaked softly with the shifting tide. Inside the house, Frank sat hunched at the dining table, laptop open, the screen's pale light painting sharp lines across his weathered face. His square jaw was tight, eyes narrowed, the scar over his brow creasing deeper as he clicked through page after page of obscure military chatter, old news clippings, and scattered mentions of something called neurostorm. Frank was not a man easily rattled. Decades at sea had taught him patience, taught him to weather the worst. But tonight, there was a gnawing in his chest he couldn't shake. Neurostorm. The name kept appearing, buried in military documents, obscure defense contractor memos, whispers on old message boards frequented by veterans. It was always tied to one thing: experimental neural enhancement in combat animals. Dogs bred and conditioned not just for obedience, but for precision, reflex, and, if the rumors were true, unthinking, near-mechanical efficiency. Behind him, the 4 rescued puppies lay curled in makeshift beds by the fire. Buddy, the largest, twitched an ear at every distant sound, his wide amber eyes ever watchful. Bella, smaller and more delicate, let out soft, anxious whines whenever Frank's old flip phone vibrated faintly on the table. Max, sharp and restless, kept darting his head toward the window at the faintest hint of wind, while Charlie, poor haunted Charlie, shuddered visibly whenever the room's old overhead light flickered. Frank's fingers paused over the keyboard, his gaze drifting to Eli, who sat cross-legged near the hearth. The boy's shaggy blonde hair was falling into his eyes, but there was the faintest trace of a smile on his pale face as Max gently butted his head against Eli's knee. Eli had always been painfully shy, but with Max, something seemed to soften, as if the puppy's flickering energy and trust had cracked a window open in the walls Eli built around himself. Frank sighed quietly, rubbing a hand through his damp salt and pepper hair. His body still ached from the rescue, the thin gash on his arm now covered by a rough bandage Daisy had helped apply, but it wasn't the physical pain that kept his stomach tight. It was the question gnawing at the edge of his mind. Who would abandon 4 animals like this? And why were they marked, scarred, and, if his reading was right, possibly altered? The tap at the door startled him. Frank rose smoothly, his tall frame unfolding with surprising grace for a man his age. He opened the door to find Warren Blake, an old friend and former Navy comrade. Warren was in his 60s, tall but slightly stooped, his once dark skin weathered by years in the sun, short-cropped gray hair, and a neatly trimmed mustache. He had a quiet, deliberate air about him, the kind of man who weighed every word before speaking. Warren had been Frank's commanding officer once, and though they had long since left uniform behind, a deep loyalty remained between them. "Frank," Warren said simply, his voice gravelly but kind, "heard you had a rescue last night. Thought I'd check in." Frank gestured him inside, and Warren's sharp, dark eyes swept the room, landing on the puppies. 4 of them, huh? Frank nodded grimly. "Not just strays. Take a look." He lifted Bella gently, parting her damp fur to reveal the grid-like scarring on her skin. Warren's brow furrowed deeply. "Seen that before," Warren murmured, "back when I was still working black operations. That's military grade, Frank. Someone didn't just abandon these pups. They were meant to disappear." Frank's gut twisted. "Neurostorm?" Warren's gaze sharpened. "Where'd you hear that name?" "I've been digging," Frank said quietly. "It's all over the defense contractor chatter. Dogs, neural conditioning, reflex enhancement, some kind of experimental program. And these 4... He let the sentence hang. Before Warren could reply, Buddy shot up, ears rigid, staring hard at the window. A faint, almost imperceptible sound floated in, a low hum, like an idling engine. Frank crossed quickly to the window, his tall frame tense, peering out into the dark. Parked down the road, partially hidden under the shadow of a sprawling oak, was a sleek black SUV. Its headlights were off, but the faint glow of the dashboard was visible through the windshield. "Frank?" Eli's voice was soft, uncertain. He had followed Max to the window, the boy's gray eyes wide and frightened. "Stay back, kid," Frank said quietly. His hand dropped instinctively to the side drawer, pulling out an old service pistol he kept stored for emergencies. He flicked off the safety, his square jaw tightening. Warren stepped up beside him, folding his arms. "You expecting company?" Frank shook his head. "No." The dogs were restless now. Bella was pacing nervously, Max's ears flicked back flat, Charlie was trembling again, and Buddy stood resolute, body poised, muscles tight. Frank drew a slow breath, his scarred fingers flexing on the pistol grip. Looks like someone's looking for their missing assets. Outside, the black SUV sat in the stillness, engine humming softly, the shape of a figure just barely visible behind the tinted glass. Frank felt his heartbeat quicken. Whoever they weren't locals, and they weren't here for a chat. The night was unnervingly quiet along the riverside. The storm long passed, leaving behind only the low murmur of the tide and the occasional creak of old wood. Frank Bishop sat in his armchair, broad shoulders hunched forward, eyes fixed on the dying embers in the fireplace. Eli, the lanky, anxious 17-year-old with sandy blonde hair, sat nearby on the floor. Max curled tightly against his side, the puppy's sharp little ears twitching with every sound. Suddenly, Buddy let out a low growl from the corner, his large golden body going rigid. Frank's head snapped up. Bella, the frailest of the 4 puppies, whimpered softly in her blanket nest, and Charlie pressed himself deeper under a chair. Frank stood slowly, the tall, square-jawed man, moving with the careful control of someone used to danger. His hand brushed the side table, fingers curling around the pistol he'd kept there for years, a habit from a life spent on the sea and never fully trusting the shore. The floorboards creaked. Frank's chest tightened. He gestured sharply to Eli, who quickly scooped up Max and scrambled back, his wide gray eyes darting in fear. Frank crossed the room in 2 swift strides, his rough, weathered hand flipping the deadbolt on the front door, just as the back door gave a sharp, deliberate rattle. Someone was inside the house. Frank turned and froze. Standing at the edge of the hallway, in the dim light spilling from the fireplace, was a figure dressed in black, tall and lean, face entirely hidden by a sleek black mask. The intruder lifted a gloved hand slowly and, without a word, tossed something small to the floor, a folded slip of paper. Then, like smoke, the figure disappeared into the dark, leaving only the faint sound of retreating footsteps. Frank's heart pounded as he stooped to retrieve the note. His scarred brow furrowed as he read the block letters, scrawled in cold, impersonal strokes. Return the assets. No second warning. Frank didn't sleep that night. By sunrise, Frank was behind the wheel of his battered pickup truck, his tall, broad figure tense as he drove through town toward the old naval district. In the passenger seat sat Captain Warren Blake, an old friend, 60 years old, his dark skin lined deeply from sun and years of hard service. Warren was a man with a thoughtful, deliberate air, his gray mustache neatly trimmed, his sharp brown eyes missing nothing. Once Frank's superior officer, Warren had long since retired, but he carried himself with the quiet authority of a man who still knew how to command when needed. Frank's voice was low, gravelly. "They were in my house, Warren." Warren nodded slowly. "I figured this would reach you sooner or later." Frank glanced over. "You knew?" "I suspected," Warren admitted. "Frank, these dogs, they're not just rescues, they're evidence, and someone high up doesn't want them alive." Frank's hands tightened on the steering wheel. "Who's behind it?" Warren exhaled heavily. "Colonel Victor Hale, you remember the name?" Frank's jaw clenched. "Yeah. Cold as hell even back then." Warren's mouth pulled into a thin line. "He's running what's left of Neurostorm, that black project they buried after the ethics board nearly tore them apart. These dogs were never meant to make it out." Frank pulled the truck over in front of Daisy's small veterinary clinic, the tires crunching softly on gravel. Daisy Monroe emerged from the building just as they stepped out. At 34, Daisy was a slim, freckled woman with a no-nonsense air, her copper-red hair pulled back in a tight ponytail. She moved with brisk purpose, her green eyes flashing as she saw Frank and Warren approaching. "You need to see Bella," she said quickly, urgency lacing her usually steady voice. Inside, Bella lay on a padded table, her delicate golden body trembling faintly, her breath shallow. Daisy hovered beside her, hands gentle but her brow deeply furrowed. "She's not just weak from dehydration," Daisy explained, her voice low. "There's something else, neurological. Her muscles aren't responding properly. She's seizing up, her reflexes are fading. Frank, if we don't get her specialized help, she's not going to last." Frank's chest tightened painfully. He reached out, brushing his calloused fingers gently over Bella's head. The puppy's eyes fluttered open weakly, her tail giving the faintest twitch. Eli stood nearby, pale and tense, Max tucked protectively under his arm. The boy's wide eyes darted between Frank and Daisy, his thin shoulders tight with worry. Warren spoke softly. "Frank, there's one person who might know how to help. Jonas Pierce." Frank turned sharply. "Jonas? I thought he vanished years ago." Warren gave a grim nod. "He did. But last I heard, he's off the grid trying to make amends. He used to be one of the lead officers in Neurostorm, until he couldn't stomach it anymore. If anyone knows how to save Bella, it's him." Frank took a slow, steady breath, his weathered face hardening. "Then we find him." Daisy's sharp green eyes flicked to Frank. "You sure about this? Frank, if these people are watching you, tracking you, I'm sure." The room was still for a long moment. Then Eli, quiet but determined, spoke up softly. "We can't let them take the dogs." Frank turned, surprised, meeting his nephew's gaze. Eli's voice trembled slightly, but there was something in his wide gray eyes, a flicker of courage Frank hadn't seen before. Frank placed a rough hand on the boy's shoulder. "No, kid, we can't." Outside, as Frank loaded the puppies carefully into the truck, a black SUV rolled slowly past the far end of the street, headlights off, its dark shape slipping like a shadow between the trees. They were running out of time. The air inside Frank Bishop's riverside home was heavy with tension. Outside, the wind stirred the trees and rattled the shutters, though no rain fell, a false calm before whatever storm was coming next. Frank stood in the center of the living room, his tall frame motionless, arms crossed over his broad chest, eyes shadowed and sharp as he stared at the group assembled before him. On the couch sat Eli, thin and pale, his shaggy blonde hair hanging slightly over his anxious gray eyes. Max, the wiry, alert puppy, was pressed tightly against the boy's side, his small body quivering, but his sharp little eyes watchful. Eli's shoulders were drawn tense, but for the first time since he had come to live with Frank, there was a determined edge in his posture, something stronger than just fear. Across from them, Daisy Monroe paced back and forth, her lean frame taut with worry. She wore her usual navy blue scrubs under a worn gray hoodie, her copper-red hair pulled back in a messy knot. Freckles dusted her pale face, and her sharp green eyes were stormy with frustration. "Frank," she said firmly, "I'm telling you, if we keep these dogs here, we're putting all of you in danger. Colonel Hale isn't going to knock politely a second time." Frank's jaw clenched. He rubbed a rough hand over his lined face, the scar over his brow tightening as he frowned. His voice was low, almost gravelly. "I won't hand them over, Daisy." Warren Blake leaned against the doorway, arms crossed. At 60, Warren was still tall and strong, though his back had a slight stoop now from years of hard service. His dark skin was lined with age, his gray hair trimmed short, and his neatly kept mustache framed a mouth that rarely smiled, but spoke with authority. He had been Frank's superior once, a long time ago, but here he stood, not as a commander, but as a brother in arms. "Frank," he rumbled, "you understand what you're up against. These people, they don't leave loose ends. They'll come hard, and they'll come fast." Frank nodded slowly. "I know." Eli stood up abruptly, his thin shoulders shaking slightly, his pale hands clenched at his sides. "Don't give them Max," he said, voice trembling but clear. "Please, Uncle Frank, don't give them any of the dogs." The room fell silent. Frank turned, looking at the boy, his nephew, the kid who had barely spoken a full sentence to anyone outside the house in months. Now, here Eli stood, legs shaky but back straight, speaking for the first time with a voice full of something Frank hadn't seen before: courage. Frank's heart tightened. He crossed the room and placed a large, calloused hand on Eli's thin shoulder. "We won't give them up, kid," he said quietly. Buddy, the largest of the puppies, lifted his head at Frank's voice, his wide amber eyes watching closely. Bella lay nearby, still weak but slightly more responsive under Daisy's careful treatment, her delicate frame curled into a blanket. Charlie, the quietest, peeked out nervously from beneath the edge of the couch, his darker golden coat blending with the shadows. Frank straightened. "If they're coming," he said, voice firm, "then we get ready." For the next several hours, the house became a flurry of activity. Frank and Warren worked together, their movements efficient, years of military habit kicking back in. Frank's tall, powerful frame moved quickly as he reinforced the doors and windows, driving thick wooden bars into place and setting up old security cameras he had long kept in storage. Warren, quieter but no less focused, helped run wiring and check sightlines, his sharp eyes constantly scanning for vulnerabilities. Daisy, despite her protests, stayed, tending to Bella, checking over Buddy's and Charlie's health, and even helping move some of Frank's heavier furniture to create barricades. She grumbled under her breath, but her hands never stopped moving, her sharp, freckled face set with fierce determination. Eli, for his part, shadowed Frank and Warren closely. The boy's thin frame moved hesitantly, but Max stayed glued to his side, the puppy darting ahead and sniffing everything as if sensing the tension in the air. Eli helped carry supplies, handed over tools, and once, even asked Warren how to help watch the cameras. Warren gave him a measured look and then, with a small nod, began teaching him the basics. As dusk settled outside, painting the river in fading gold, Frank stepped back to look over their work. The house was fortified. Not perfect, but better than most would expect from a retired seaman's cottage. Frank exhaled slowly, running a hand through his salt and pepper hair. His weathered face was lined with exhaustion, but his dark eyes burned with quiet resolve. "They'll come," he murmured. Beside him, Warren adjusted his jacket, "and when they do, we hold the line." In the corner, Eli knelt beside Max, softly stroking the puppy's silky fur. The boy's face, usually pale and tense, held a flicker of something new: hope. Frank watched him, feeling a swell of fierce protectiveness rise in his chest. He wasn't just fighting for the dogs. He was fighting for Eli, for Daisy, for Warren, for the fragile patchwork family that had somehow come together around these four broken golden souls. Outside, the last light slipped below the horizon. Somewhere far off, an engine rumbled softly in the dark. The rain began as a whisper against the windows, soft and patient, as if the sky itself were holding its breath. But soon, it grew. A relentless drumbeat on the roof, the kind of rain that soaks the world to its bones. Frank Bishop stood near the front window, his tall, broad-shouldered frame framed in the glow of a single lamp. His scarred face was hard, every line carved deeper by tension, his salt and pepper hair damp with sweat. Outside, the night was blacker than pitch, the storm's fury turning the river into a roiling mass of silver-edged waves. The wind howled, rattling the fortified shutters and groaning against the wooden walls. Inside, the air was electric. Eli crouched in the corner, thin and pale, his blonde hair plastered to his forehead as he held Max close. The wiry, quick puppy trembled slightly, but remained alert, his sharp eyes darting to every noise, every shadow. Beside them, Daisy Monroe worked quickly, her lean, freckled hands checking over Bella for what felt like the 100th time. Bella, delicate and small, lay wrapped in blankets, her breathing shallow but determined. Daisy, normally steady and sharp, looked worn, her copper-red hair clinging damply to her temples, her green eyes rimmed with worry. But her movements never slowed. Warren Blake stood guard at the back, his 60-year-old frame still solid, though slightly stooped. His dark skin was etched with age, and his graying mustache framed a mouth that rarely smiled. Tonight, his sharp eyes were harder than usual, his old military instincts fully awake. He carried his rifle like a man who remembered how it felt to fight in the dark. Then Buddy growled, a low, vibrating sound from deep in his broad chest. The largest of the four golden retrievers, Buddy had positioned himself near the front door, ears stiff, amber eyes fixed forward. Charlie, the quietest, had hidden under the couch, but now crept out, his darker golden coat blending with the dim light, nose twitching, sensing something. Frank's voice was low. "They're here." The first blow came hard, a slam against the reinforced front door that shook the entire house. Frank didn't flinch. He had seen storms like this at sea, but tonight the monsters weren't the waves. Outside, under the cover of rain, dark figures moved with precision. Men in black tactical gear, faces obscured by masks, rifles slung over their shoulders. At their center was Colonel Victor Hale himself, a tall, imposing figure with sharp, hawkish features, cold, steel-gray eyes, and short-cropped black hair streaked with white at the temples. His military uniform was spotless, despite the storm, his gloves black leather, his expression void of sympathy. Hale was a man known for his ruthless efficiency, a commander who believed loyalty was earned only through results. His reputation was whispered about in military circles, a man who saw no difference between an asset and a disposable tool. Frank braced at the window. "Stay sharp." Suddenly the door cracked under another violent hit. Frank and Warren moved as one, guns raised. Eli scrambled further back, pressing Max and Charlie close. Daisy clutched Bella protectively, her heart hammering so hard she thought it might split her chest. Then it happened. The door gave way. Buddy was the first to move. The massive dog lunged forward with a snarl, teeth bared, launching himself at the first man through the breach. The mercenary barely had time to register the golden blur before he was slammed backward, hitting the ground hard. Max darted like a flash of lightning, weaving through the chaos, nipping at ankles, snapping at gloved hands. Despite his young age, his speed and unpredictability made him a maddening target, forcing attackers to waste precious seconds. Charlie, usually the most timid, suddenly turned sharp, his sensitive ears picking up the faint scrape of movement near the back window. He barked sharply, an urgent warning. Warren spun, firing once. A masked figure crashed through the glass, but fell instantly, taken down by Warren's sharp shot. Frank roared as another figure lunged through the front, his scarred hands slamming the intruder into the wall. His strength, weathered by years of sea and labor, was still formidable, and he fought with the precision of a man who had long stopped fearing death. In the middle of it all, Daisy crouched low over Bella, whispering to her, shielding her small body as boots pounded the floor around them. But when one mercenary broke past Frank's defense, Daisy's protective instincts exploded. She grabbed a heavy metal rod from the fireplace and then swung with a fierce cry, striking the attacker across the arm. The mercenary staggered, just enough for Buddy to leap, dragging him down. Outside, Hale watched, his cold eyes narrowing. He raised a hand, signaling a retreat. Just a test, just a probe. The true strike would come soon. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of sweat, gunpowder, and wet fur. The storm roared louder, thunder cracking above the house like the world itself was splitting open. Frank stood, chest heaving, as he looked around. Warren covered the back, eyes sharp. Daisy cradled Bella, rocking slightly, murmuring soft words. Eli sat against the wall, pale but alive. Max pressed into his lap, Charlie leaning nervously against his leg. Buddy stood near the door, chest puffing, a protector ready for another fight. Frank's voice, rough and steady, broke the tense silence. "They'll be back!" And outside, beyond the battered walls, Colonel Hale smiled thinly in the rain. The game was far from over. The morning after the storm arrived, golden and fragile, casting shafts of sunlight through the broken windows of Frank Bishop's riverside home. The rain had stopped, but the evidence of the night's violence remained. Shattered glass on the floor, splintered door frames, muddy footprints, and the faint scent of gunpowder still clinging to the air. Frank, tall and broad-shouldered with his scarred brow and lined face, stood at the kitchen table, his strong hands spread over a thick folder of documents. His dark eyes, weathered from decades at sea, were sharper than they had been in years. Across from him stood Warren Blake, his old Navy friend, 60 years old, skin dark and sun-worn, gray hair close-cropped, his solid frame still carrying the air of authority even in retirement. Warren's brown eyes were grim as he looked over the damning papers they had collected. Blueprints, reports, photographs, all taken from a stash Frank and Warren had quietly raided from one of Colonel Hale's safe houses after the attack. Beside the two men, Daisy Monroe leaned in, her slender figure braced on her elbows, freckled face pale but determined, copper-red hair loose and tangled from the chaos of the past 24 hours. "Are you sure this is enough?" she murmured, her sharp green eyes flicking between the pages. "It's one thing to know Hale's dirty, but proving it—" Warren gave a slow nod. "This is enough." His voice was low, confident, the voice of a man who had carried out dangerous missions on less. Eli hovered near the edge of the room, his thin 17-year-old frame stiff with nerves, sandy blonde hair hanging over his anxious gray eyes. Max, the smallest and quickest of the rescued golden retrievers, was tucked against Eli's legs, his fluffy body tense but calm, sensing the change in the air. Buddy lay by the window, massive and alert, his wide golden eyes watchful. Bella, still fragile, rested on a pile of blankets, her delicate body slowly recovering thanks to Daisy's devoted care. Charlie, the quietest, hovered near Frank, as if sensing the man's heavy thoughts. Frank straightened, his square jaw tightening. "Let's finish this." They drove to the military police headquarters in Savannah, a low concrete building ringed with chain-link fences and guarded gates. Frank, Warren, Daisy, and Eli arrived in Frank's battered pickup, the back lined with crates to hide the puppies from prying eyes. Inside the headquarters, they were met by Major Sarah Whitaker, a no-nonsense officer in her late 40s, tall and lean, with short-cropped blonde hair, pale skin, and piercing blue eyes that had the sharpness of someone used to cutting through lies. Dressed in crisp fatigues, her posture was military straight, and her handshake was firm when Warren introduced her. "I know you," Sarah said, giving Frank a quick, assessing glance. "Bishop, right? The old storm dog who used to run Coast Guard salvage, runs out of Charleston?" Frank gave a small, tight smile. "That's me." Sarah's sharp gaze softened slightly. "I used to hear stories. Never thought I'd meet you under these circumstances." She turned to Warren. "You said you have something." Warren handed over the folder. Sarah opened it carefully, her eyes scanning the top pages. Her face, sharp and intelligent, shifted as she took in the weight of what she was seeing. "Colonel Victor Hale," Warren said quietly. "Neurostorm project, classified weapons testing on canines, evidence of discarded assets, illegal experiments, and an attempted cover-up." Sarah's fingers froze on the edge of a photo. One of the puppies, ribs visible under their damp fur, trapped inside the wooden crate at sea. She looked up, blue eyes flashing. "You're sure about this?" Frank met her gaze evenly. "We're sure." Sarah nodded once, crisply. "I'll mobilize a unit. We'll bring him in." What followed happened swiftly. Military police units raided Hale's private compound on the outskirts of the city, a sleek modern house hidden behind tall fences. Its guards caught off guard when black SUVs rolled in before dawn. Colonel Victor Hale, tall, sharp-featured, dressed in tailored black even in his own home, greeted the officers with icy disdain, his gray eyes flicking over the warrant like it was a personal insult. But as the charges were read, as the evidence stacked up, as the handcuffs clicked into place, something in Hale's expression finally cracked. A brief flicker of realization that, this time, he wouldn't simply slip away. The news spread quickly. By afternoon, Frank's phone was buzzing nonstop. Reporters wanted statements, animal rights activists were flooding social media, and Old Navy contacts were calling in stunned amazement. Eli scrolled through the online headlines with wide eyes. Neurostorm exposed. Secret military dog experiment shocks nation. Golden retrievers rescued from illegal tests become national symbols. Coast Guard veteran and local team uncover darkest corners of black ops. Frank sat on his porch, long legs stretched out, the weight of exhaustion heavy in his broad chest, but his heart lighter than it had been in years. He wasn't a man who cared for fame or recognition. He'd walked away from medals and honors long ago. But when Eli leaned his thin shoulder against his, when Max curled warmly at their feet, when Daisy stepped onto the porch carrying 2 mugs of hot coffee and smiled at them with soft green eyes, Frank understood the truth. This was the only reward that mattered. Behind him, Buddy rumbled a contented sigh, flopping into the grass. Bella, delicate but stubborn, hobbled after Daisy, her tail wagging weakly. Charlie lounged in the doorway, his darker coat gleaming in the afternoon sun. Frank exhaled slowly, his scarred brow relaxing. For the first time in a long while, his family, strange, patched together but whole, was safe. A year had passed, and the harbor at Savannah breathed under the soft glow of a rising sun. The air was crisp but gentle, a far cry from the roaring storms of the past, and the sea stretched out in a calm expanse, reflecting pale gold and pink hues on its surface. The salty breeze ruffled the hair of Frank Bishop as he stood at the edge of the dock, hands tucked into the pockets of his well-worn jacket. His tall, broad-shouldered figure looked relaxed. The deep lines of his scarred face softened under the morning light. The salt and pepper in his hair touched more by silver now, but his dark eyes still sharp and steady. Beside him stood Eli, no longer the timid, wide-eyed boy from a year ago. 17 now, Eli's sandy blonde hair had been cut neater, and though his frame was still slim, His posture was taller, straighter, his gray eyes more confident. He wore a simple navy hoodie and jeans, and a small smile tugged at his lips as he watched the four golden shapes darting along the beach below. Max, the quick, wiry puppy who had once been all nervous energy, was now a graceful young dog, sprinting with joyful bursts along the sand. Bella, delicate but strong-willed, trotted carefully at Daisy's side, her pale golden coat gleaming in the light, her steps more sure since recovering from her injuries. Daisy Monroe stood a few paces back, her copper-red hair braided loosely over one shoulder, freckles scattered across her pale cheeks. Now 35, she had opened her own veterinary clinic in town, a modest place but filled with warmth, where every rescue animal found a voice and every worried pet owner found understanding. Daisy wore a gray sweater over faded jeans, her green eyes crinkling at the corners as she laughed softly at Buddy, the big gentle giant of the group who was attempting to herd Charlie, the quietest of the dogs, away from an overly curious seagull. Warren Blake leaned casually against a wooden piling, arms crossed, his tall 61-year-old frame relaxed. His skin was still deeply tanned and lined, his close-cropped gray hair neat, his dark eyes steady with the calm of a man who had seen too much but refused to let it harden him. He gave Frank a side glance, the corners of his mouth lifting in a small, approving smile. "You ever think we'd get here, Frank?" Frank let out a low, amused exhale. Not once. His voice was rough but lighter now, as if the old weight pressing on his chest had finally lifted. The past year hadn't been easy. There were hearings, investigations, endless military paperwork to close the book on Neurostorm and Colonel Victor Hale. But through it all, Frank had kept his focus on the little things, repairing his home, helping Daisy rebuild her practice, guiding Eli through his slow, steady journey from anxious shadows into the world again. Max barked happily and darted up the sand toward Eli, his tongue lolling out as he skidded to a stop by the boy's feet. Eli reached down with a grin, ruffling Max's golden fur with a confidence Frank remembered never seeing before. Daisy walked over with Bella trotting beside her, the small dog gently leaning into her leg as they approached. "She's doing better every day," Daisy said softly, glancing down at Bella. "The nerves are healing more than we thought they could." Frank gave her a small nod. "That's because you didn't give up." Daisy's green eyes sparkled with gratitude, and she bumped her shoulder lightly against Frank's arm. "Neither did you." Down the shore, Buddy gave a joyful bark as he splashed through the shallow waves, chasing after Charlie, who dashed with surprising speed, his darker golden coat glinting in the light. The two dogs tumbled together in the surf, rolling and laughing in their way, full of life and freedom. Frank watched them, his chest tightening slightly, not with pain, but with something tender and old, something he hadn't felt in a long time. Family. He exhaled slowly, his gaze drifting over Eli, over Daisy, over Warren, over the four dogs who had once been left to die at sea, but now shone as bright as the dawn. "Come on, old man," Warren teased gently, pushing off the piling. "You gonna stand there all morning, or join us for breakfast?" Frank chuckled under his breath. "Give me a minute." Warren nodded knowingly and wandered toward Daisy and Eli, giving them a pat on the shoulder, his deep voice rumbling low as they talked. Frank stayed where he was, facing the sea. His rough hands dug deeper into his jacket pockets as he whispered softly, almost to himself, "That day, out there in the storm, I didn't just save them." His eyes softened, watching the four dogs dance in the waves, Eli's laughter mixing with Daisy's gentle voice, Warren's calm steadiness anchoring them all. "They saved me too." And as the sun rose higher, the past slipped further away. The scars faded just a little more, and Frank Bishop stood quietly at the edge of a life he hadn't known he could have. A life rebuilt from love, loyalty, and the healing power of second chances. Sometimes, the greatest miracles are not thunderous or grand. They come quietly, in the shape of four fragile dogs pulled from a stormy sea, in the courage of a shy boy learning to stand tall, in the quiet redemption of a man who thought his life was over. We may not always see the hand of God working in our lives, but He is there, in every second chance, in every act of compassion, in every heartbeat that dares to hope again. Frank's story, Eli's story, Buddy, Bella, Max, and Charlie's story. They remind us that even when the world seems cold, when storms rage and shadows loom, there is light waiting to break through. Maybe today, your miracle is waiting just around the corner. A small kindness, a moment of love, a sign that you are not alone. We believe that God watches over every soul, human or animal, that cries out for rescue, and that He sends His angels, sometimes disguised as people like Frank, or maybe even like you, to be the hands of love in a broken world. If this story touched your heart, we invite you to share it. Comment below and subscribe to our channel. Together, we can spread messages of hope and healing far and wide. And as you go about your day, may God bless you and keep you. May He fill your home with peace. And may He remind you always that even the smallest life is precious in His eyes. Share, comment, subscribe, and may God's light guide you today and always.